Hi there. One of the best ways to promote your digital artwork is to create a business card. Having a business card will make it really easy to network with people because you can hand out your card and it'll have all of your services, a sample of your artwork, and your contact information and a link to your portfolio. You can hand these out to people or you can leave them places, and it's a really good way to just kind of get your name out there. Unfortunately, it's not something that you can do with Corel Painter, and I know a lot of my videos are Corel Painter videos, but this would be pretty much, you'd be pulling your hair out trying to do any of this stuff in Corel Painter. Even though there is a text tool and everything, it's just a real pain. So I would suggest using Photoshop for this. You can get a free 30-day trial of Photoshop from Adobe's website. If you go to the download link and then product trials and select Photoshop. It's also quite affordable to just rent it on a monthly basis with their Creative Cloud service. You can check that out too. We'll go back to Photoshop, and so we have an example here of just a quick card that I made. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to need to pick a place to print your cards from. You can print them yourself, or you can have them printed through an online service. I'm not really going to suggest anybody specifically, but I made some cards for somebody the other day, one of my clients, and they went with this website here, and their specs were a product size of 3.5 inches by 2 inches with a bleed size of 3.75 by 2.25 inches. So essentially what that means is the card is going to get trimmed off where this dotted line is, and anything that's outside of that dotted line is probably going to get cut off. So if you had a background that you wanted to bleed to the edge, which is a printing term, if you want the ink to go all the way off the edge of the paper so there's not a white border or anything, then you have to have it go past the paper and then they trim it off. So there's a certain margin you have to account for when you're making your cards. Some websites might not have this, it might not matter, and you can just upload your image as is, but it's good to check and see. It'll save you a lot of time and you won't have to redesign the card after you finish it. Also note some things that they want specific file types and specific resolution or DPI. And for the backside, they want you to rotate the image 180 degrees. So basically they want you to flip it upside down so that it prints properly. So you kind of have to watch out for some stuff like that too. But most printing websites will have specs, or they'll have a template, which is a file you can download to open in Photoshop. Once you have the correct specs, you could even use these specs here. We'll go ahead and move forward. So we know our product size is going to be 3.5 by 2, and we want this bleed size to be what they have listed here. So there's a few different ways we can do this. I find that the easiest way for me is to just make a new document, and we'll make it the size that we want to eventually trim it as, which is 3.5 by 2 inches. So we're going to change our width from inches, or from pixels to inches. So we're going to go 3.5 inches by 2 inches, and we'll set our resolution to 300. And our color mode, we're going to set to CMYK, because that's the kind of color mode you have to use when you're printing. You could use RGB also, it kind of really doesn't matter too much, but we'll just kind of use proper printing principles here. And then we'll name our card if we want. You can name it anything you want, and we'll go to OK. And then I recommend going ahead and just saving your card right now, just so you don't have to really worry about messing anything up. Then you'll know where it is. So the next thing that we'll do is we're going to make sure that you can see your rulers. So what you have to do is you have to go to the View menu and then select Rulers, or you could hit Control R on your keyboard and that will hide and reveal these rulers up here. So once you have a ruler, you can click on the ruler and drag with your mouse to drag down a guide, and when you release your mouse, you will release your guide. You hover over it, and when you get this little icon, you can adjust it. So what these guides will do is they'll just kind of let us set some reference marks. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we snap to this edge here, the edge of the document, and if that's not happening, we want to go to the View menu and make sure Snap's enabled, and then under the Snap to menu, make sure that Snap to Document Bounds or Guides is enabled. And we'll go ahead and just drag another guide down here to the bottom. And do the two sides. So now we've got guides that surround our card here. Now we'll go to the image menu and we'll go to canvas size. And we're going to change the size of our canvas, which is going to make our card bigger, but our guides are going to stay in the same place. That way our guides will be representative of where the card will be trimmed. So we'll change this to 3.75 and 2.25 because that's going to be our bleed dimensions that were required by the printer. And we just want to make sure that this little dot's in the center here so that everything expands from the center outward. And we'll click OK. And there you go. Now we've added this bleed area, and that's exactly what we need. So now we want to make sure that when we're designing our card that we don't let anything go outside of this line that we don't want to get cut off. So it's okay if color or a background pattern gets cut off because that needs to bleed off of the page. But anything else like your information, you don't want it to go even anywhere near this line here. If you're just going to have a white background, you don't have to worry about anything at all. Just make sure that everything stays in the center here. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit because the card's going to end up printing small, so we don't want to really look at it too big. And what I recommend doing is making a folder to store your card Photoshop file in, and then within that folder you could also store some assets if you already have them, like artwork or graphics or your logo, things that you might want to use, or a photograph, anything that you're going to want to put on the card. Just get all that stuff together and put it in the same folder. That's just good design practice for everything, I think. So here's the folder I have here, and it's got my logo. It's a pretty good sized version of it, that way I can print it in a high resolution. And I've got just a piece of artwork here that I'm going to throw on my card. I recommend that if you're an artist and you're making a business card for yourself, you should put a piece of artwork on it. I wouldn't go crazy and put 20 pieces of art, because it's going to be a small card. But just pick one thing that kind of stands alone nicely. This piece in particular has a white background already, so I can kind of place it anywhere and work text around it. And once you've got your image, it's going to make it a lot easier to pick colors and things too. So I'm going to select these two images, and the way I like to do my layouts for pretty much anything that I do graphic design related is I generally like to put the images in first and then do the text after that, because generally speaking the text ends up flowing around the images. So a really quick way to put images into your Photoshop document is to just select whichever images or files you want. You can hold Control on your keyboard and click on multiple files to select different files here, and then I'm going to drag it down to my taskbar, my Windows taskbar, and hover over the Photoshop icon, and Photoshop will open. And then I'm going to, still while holding down on the mouse, go over to the Photoshop window that's now open, and I'm just going to release my mouse, and that's going to place these files into the document. And then if I don't want to resize them at all, which in this case I don't really want to do right now, I'm just going to click the checkbox to commit to that placement, and do the same for this one. And now these two image assets are added as their own separate layers in Photoshop. There's a special icon here that indicates that these are smart layers, so if I scale them up or down, they're not going to degrade in image quality. So now that these images are in here, we can kind of play around with them a little bit. If you find that your images are coming in too small for this resolution of 300 dpi, I recommend finding a way to either enlarge the images or pick a different image, because you might need a pretty big image here to work with this type of resolution. The reason why we're working with 300 dpi is because it just makes for a nicer print. So now we can use the black arrow tool here to move these layers around wherever we want them to be. And if we want to change the order of the layers, the way that they're stacked, we can drag them. So if I want to put the logo on top of the moth, I click and drag, and I can move one on top of the other. If we want to change the size of them or scale them, you can hit Control T or you can go to Edit, Free Transform. It's always good to use the shortcuts though. And then it'll give you these transform handles. Now, if you just drag one of them, you're going to end up squashing your image, which you probably don't want to do. So what you're going to want to do to correct that is hold Shift while you're dragging, and Shift will constrain it in proportion. If you also hold Alt while holding Shift, it will scale from the center while constraining. So that can be helpful if you've already placed something. You can keep it in the same place, but you can just make it bigger or smaller. So I'm going to make my logo about this big. I'm going to click the checkbox to commit to that change, and then I'm going to just drag it over to the side here. If you want to drag something and constrain it to an axis, like the horizontal axis here, and what I mean by that is I'm moving it, but I can't move it up or down, even if I move my mouse up or down. This is happening because I'm holding Shift. So as I was dragging, I started holding Shift, and it constrained it to this axis. If I wanted to constrain it vertically, I could start dragging it vertically and hold Shift. Now you can see that I can't move it to the left or the right. So I'm just going to put it right about here, and I'm going to resize my moth. Again, I'm going to do Control T to transform it, and I'm going to scale it from the center while constraining by holding Shift and Alt. Let's make it about this big. Put it right here. These keyboard shortcuts are really important because it makes it faster to do things if you don't have to keep repositioning everything. So if you can kind of just keep things aligned from the beginning, it's going to make it easier to work with later. So now one thing we should look into before we start really placing text and everything, you're going to want to find some way to divide up this card and make it look nice. And you have to kind of account for what you have in here. So I know I have the logo, I want it to be about this big, and I want there to be a lot of artwork because it's going to be a small card. It might, look something like this. So I really want the artwork to stand out, and the text just has to be readable. It's just going to be some information. So if we want to know where to place things, just to make them look good, you can use something that's called the rule of thirds. And if you imagine that your canvas is divided up into a grid, I'll give you an example here. This is a grid that's a rule of thirds grid. So everything's divided into 3 equal rows, 3 equal columns. So what I recommend doing is placing your image assets or your text within these areas. So my logo's within this column in this row here, and then my artwork is mostly taking up these 2 here, and then everything else can kind of just flow around it. But that generally makes it easy to do a layout. If you just kind of do everything with the rule of thirds, your layouts are going to look good 99% of the time. I pulled up that grid by going to the crop tool here, and then you can just click, and you have to be careful because if you change this box at all, it's going to trim off some of your image, so be careful not to do that, but you can use it just to get a visual. So I think I'm alright with the placement of this stuff. I'm just going to tidy up some things here, and I'm going to double click on these layer names, and I'm going to name them just to make it look nicer. And now we can go ahead and add some text. So we can take the text tool here, or you can hit T on your keyboard for the text tool, and I'm just going to click, and we can start typing some text. Now I recommend picking a font that's readable, and you want to pick something that's obviously not too big and too small. Depending on if you're going to have it aligned to the left or right or center, you might want to pick that first. I'm going to pick center because I want my text here to be centered. I'm just going to go ahead and type in my name, click OK to commit to that. You don't really have to worry too much about the font size because you can transform text like you can with an image doing Control T on your keyboard. And so rather than, hunt around with these font sizes here trying to pick the right size, I'll just scale it down and then go ahead and round it off to a nice even point size here. So 10 works pretty well for that. I would say for the card, for a business card, you probably shouldn't go any smaller than about 8, and 6 would even be pushing it, because it's not going to be very readable for the average person. For your font size, you probably want somewhere between 9 and 14, unless you're going to have just a really big piece of text or something, or a logo. You could do that pretty big. And really, it's up to you how you want to design this. You don't have to do everything horizontally. You could do it vertically. You could make a bigger, wider card, or a skinny, thinner card, or really anything you want. This is just kind of the principles of making a card. It's not, I'm not telling you that you have to do everything the way I'm doing it here, design-wise. So as I mentioned earlier about keeping alignment to save you time, here's another neat little trick. So if we're going to want more text that's going to be the same font size and aligned the same way that this is here, rather than going to the type tool and placing another piece of type and then having to constantly realign all the pieces of type that you add, it's easier just to clone what you have. So the way that you clone something is you hold down Alt when you have the arrow tool selected, and your icon will change to this double arrow. See, there's a black and a white one. And anytime that you click and you drag with that icon, you'll clone a new layer into that position. So if you clone and you hold Shift, now you can constrain your clone to an axis. So if we constrain it now to this vertical axis, we get a copy that's aligned. So we don't have to align it later. It's already pre-aligned. And since we picked center alignment ahead of time, when we go to change this text, it will stay aligned. And if we didn't do that, it would possibly be left aligned, and then we'd have to go through and do an extra step of having to realign it and everything. So thinking ahead really helps when you're working with this kind of stuff. You can give yourself whatever kind of title you want. I'm just going to say visual artist, but sometimes I use illustrator or artist for hire, or lots of different things. Then we'll click the checkbox to commit to that text. And again, if we wanted to add more text with the layer we want to clone selected, hold down Alt on the keyboard, drag, hold Shift while holding Alt and dragging and holding with your mouse still, and then release your mouse and Shift and Alt together when you want to just leave it somewhere there. If we want to change the text, select the text tool and we can change it. You could put in, a phone number. I'm not going to give you my phone number here, but you could put in your phone number if you want. All this text you can place wherever you want, and if you decide you don't like it where it is, of course you could move it somewhere else. That goes for any of this stuff. If you wanted to move something as a group and keep it all together, maybe I want to move this logo and this text together, I can hold down Shift and click on the logo layer to select contiguous layers, or to select independent layers I can hold down Control and just pick different layers here. With the layers selected, then I can do a Control G to group them, and then I can make a group here that I can manipulate. So with this group selected now, I can move the entire group. If I want to move independent objects within the group, I can select them and then I can move them. Again, I'm holding Shift to keep things constrained. You can also use the arrow keys on your keyboard, up and down and left and right. If you hold Shift while using the arrow keys, you can nudge things in larger increments. So if you want to kind of fine-tune something, that's pretty easy to do. And again, you just go back to the group if you want to move the group as a whole. Now, centering things and aligning things is pretty easy to do in Photoshop. Let's say we want to make sure that this whole group here is perfectly centered with the entire card here. So we can use something as a reference to center upon, which is the card background, because it takes up the whole document. So anything that we choose to center it with, it will get centered just basically in the center of the document. So with background selected, that's this white background. We can hold Control on our keyboard and select the info layer, which is this here. And we'll get some alignment options. And we'll go with this option here, which is align vertical centers. So now we know that this piece of info is more or less perfectly centered. This doesn't always get it right, and it does most of the time, but you might find that even if it is perfectly centered by what Photoshop thinks is centered, aesthetically it doesn't look right to the eye. So I would still recommend adjusting things until you feel that they're centered or they're where you think they should be. So I'm going to move this around a little bit using my arrow keys, and then my moth I think is pretty good where I want it. Let's add some more text. So I'm going to go back to this info layer, and I'm going to clone some of this text here by holding Alt on my keyboard. And let's put some more contact info. It's good to let people know how to get a hold of you. And if you have a website, that's even better to put on your card. You could also put your Facebook page or your Twitter feed, pretty much anything that you would use to contact people. Skype. I recommend, if you have a really long, complicated website name like I do, and it's multiple words, you can use caps here, because it doesn't matter if people type them in with the caps or without the caps, it's still going to go to your website. And I feel it makes it easier to read. You don't have to put in the www, and you don't have to put in the http, semicolon, // all that junk. It's really up to you what you want to use here. You could go with something like that. Sometimes it just depends on your design. So I see that this is too big to fit within my safe area here, so we're going to have to change the font size a bit to 8. Let's see if we can get away with 9. 9 will work. Put it maybe about here. Let's clone this again, holding Alt and Shift to keep it aligned while cloning. And let's put in some info about what we do, just so people get a good idea. If you have multiple mediums that you work in, or you offer multiple services, put that kind of stuff in, and then people will get just a quick glimpse into what you're capable of doing. I'm using these pipe characters here, which is you get them by holding Shift and then hitting the / key to divide my my little keywords here. But you could use anything you want, really. You could use dashes if you want to. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'll just put maybe just about that. And a lot of the times I just do things by eye. I'm not going to get too crazy about this amount of space here versus this amount of space here. If it looks good to me visually, I'm going to have to say that that's probably good enough. I noticed that this line here isn't centered, so we're going to center that. I'm going to click on this line of text, and then also hold Control and click on the background layer. I'm going to make sure that it's centered. Do the same thing with the info at the top here. Make sure that's centered. And now I know for sure it's looking pretty good. Zoom out a little bit, because you're going to want to look at your card at approximately the size that it's going to be printed. And that's going to vary depending on how close you are to your screen and what size your screen is. I'm working on a 47-inch HD TV, so everything generally looks really, really huge, and I have to really zoom out. I find that 25% to 15%, somewhere in that range, is generally, if I hold a print up to the screen, that's about what size it is. But perceptually, I think 25% is a good view to look at something as it's going to print if you're working in 300 dpi. So that would be, in my opinion, a pretty satisfactory card. If you wanted to change the background, that's pretty easy to do. You can put in a piece of artwork if you wanted to, or you could just throw in a solid color. I recommend making a new layer and just calling it BG for background, and you can use the paint bucket to pick a color. We'll use yellow, and we run into a little issue here where this graphic has a white background. There's a few different ways we can get rid of that. We can try a blend mode of multiply, which works really well if the background's white. It pretty much makes the whole background go away. As we'll see if we move the moth layer up here. See, it kind of almost looks like it's going behind the layer. So you get rid of that white background, whereas if we put it on normal, then you can see it covers everything up. So that's one way. If we don't want to use a blend mode to multiply, then we can do a secret trick here where we double click right in between where it says the name of the layer and this little icon. If we drag this slider here, we can knock out some of the background. You basically just keep dragging till your background goes away. So what this is doing is it's essentially hiding everything that's white and so on up until this point. So if there's a lot of white in your image, that's going to disappear too. So you'll have to kind of watch out for that. Ideally, you want to use images that don't have backgrounds if you don't want the background to interfere with your layout. But in this case, that works. And if I wanted to do that with my logo too, I could do that. Just use a multiply blend mode. And now I have a nice yellow background for my card. Let's scoot this moth back somewhere. Looking at it kind of close, and I'm seeing there's still some fringe on here. So I'm going to go back in, and so you can see it starts to remove the light color, so you have to kind of watch out. You can also try this trick here. I'm going to set it back to normal. You can try to use the magic wand tool to do a selection and remove the background. What I recommend doing is, instead of trying to delete the pixels, which you won't be able to do if you have a smart layer enabled here, is just use a mask. Just click on the mask here and go to invert here in your properties panel for your masks, and you'll have some varying success here. This doesn't work only because I put a drop shadow on my artwork. So ultimately what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the blend mode to multiply, because I don't think that looks too bad. And this would look pretty cool. And if I wanted to change my background, rather than filling it again with the paint bucket tool, I recommend using a live effect here, or color overlay. And if you click on the swatch here, you will get some different color options for your background, and then you can just kind of hunt and pick and find something that looks good. Looks kind of cool. Click OK. And there you go. You can see it's pretty easy to change the background. If we want to change the colors of our fonts, of course you can just go to the swatch here when you have the font selected that you want to change. Let's say I want to change the color of my name here. I could change it to white. Or what can be faster sometimes is, again, to use one of these effects here, color overlay, pick something like white, go to OK, and then if you right click on this layer now, you can go to copy layer style, and that will copy this effect that you put on the layer. Then you can select all the other layers that you want to make white, right click on them, and do paste layer style, and there you go. Maybe you want to put a drop shadow on some of this text to help it stand out. Double click on effects, add a drop shadow by clicking this checkbox. Click on the drop shadow to change some of the settings. And again, if you want to copy the layer style by right clicking, you can do that. Select the multiple layers that you want to apply the style to, right click and do paste layer style, And there you go. Now, of course, I don't really like this background being orange, and now the drop shadow doesn't work at all, nor does the color overlay, so we'll just go ahead and just turn off the effects for all this and put it back to normal how we had it. Of course, you will want to make a backside for your card, more than likely. So what I recommend doing is grouping together all of your layers from your front side, because you could make two separate documents, but there's kind of really no reason to. It'll just be more of an effort for you to have to work between two documents. So I've got my front here. I can duplicate it by right-clicking on it and go to Duplicate Group. Call it Back. I'm going to hide the front layer. So now we're only looking at the back. And we want to get rid of some of this stuff here, like the logo and the moth. Maybe we don't want that on the back layer. And let's delete some more of this stuff here. Let's just keep my contact info. Just for example's sake, this will be our backside. But you could really do whatever you want. You could have a piece of artwork, or you could have some additional information. And let's just make it a different color. We'll go ahead and make it this orange color so we can distinguish between the two. So we've got our backside, got our front side. So now what you're going to want to do is, as we were looking at earlier with our design specs, this particular printing service wants a TIFF, a JPEG, or an EPS. If you're working with vector art, which we're not in this case because we're working in Photoshop, we're not going to be exporting an EPS file. A JPEG would degrade the image quality a little bit and possibly change the colors, so we don't want to use a JPEG. So we're going to go with TIFF. That's the best option here. I use TIFF a lot for printing high-res artwork. So what you want to do is you want to hide and reveal this back and this front depending on what you want to save. Go to File and Save As. Select TIFF from the format. We don't want to save with layers, so uncheck this box. We're going to call it card front. I recommend not using spaces and using a hyphen if you're going to try to represent a space. Save this. Choose LZW compression. That'll just make the file smaller, but it's not going to hurt the image quality. And again, make sure that there's no layers. The rest of these settings you can just leave as they are and click OK. And now you have a file, a TIFF file that you can print for the front of your card. And now we'll do the same for the back side. We'll hide the front layer, reveal the back layer, and go to File, Save As, choose the TIFF format, uncheck the layers box, and we'll save it as card back. And now if we take a look at our image assets folder, you can see that we've got a card back and a card front that we can upload to our website and check it to see if it will print properly. You'll want to ensure that none of your text is getting cut off by the bleed or any of the boundary guides that they have set up for you. And if they are, let's say for instance, maybe some of this info, like this info up here, is too close to the edge, you can just move it, adjust it down using your arrow keys on your keyboard. And we could do the same thing with the email down here at the bottom, and just kind of scoot things around to get it looking the way you want. I recommend printing a test batch of cards. Print a few. Don't order like 2,000 cards, because if there's something wrong with them, maybe the font you chose isn't readable, or the colors didn't turn out the way you wanted to, or something got cut off even though you didn't think it would. It's always good to do test prints first. That way if something's messed up, you can fix it, and then when it's finally looking the way you want it to print wise, then you can print a whole bunch of them. Regarding fonts, I 99% of the time I think I just use Myriad Pro. I like sans serif fonts for text that needs to be readable. Sans serif is the type of font that doesn't have a bunch of fancy embellishments on it. Like, for instance, Georgia, if we use that, see how at the ends of all of these letters there's these little hooks and all these little extra little bits. Those are called serifs, and they make the font possibly harder to read, even though they make the font look nicer. Some fonts, have serifs that are still readable, but I, for the most part, feel that it's just better to have the font be as readable as possible, especially if it's going to be small. So I just go with something like Myriad Pro. You could also use Verdana or Tahoma or Arial. Any of those fonts are all pretty much the same. But I don't recommend using something really, really wacky for all of your text, because it might look cool, but people aren't going to be able to read it, and people are just going to throw your card away if they can't read it and get any, useful information out of it. As far as paper goes, be careful what kind of paper you print on, because if you print on a colored paper or a natural paper, it might change the colors of some of your artwork when it blends with the paper color. And you also have to watch out for those white backgrounds. If there's a little white background around some of your image, you're going to have to watch out for that, because it might end up printing. So sometimes it's just easier just to work with a white background because of that. And if you run into that issue, now you know how to fix it. So there you go. Now you can make your own business cards. If you have any other questions, feel free to comment on this video, and I'll be glad to assist you further. If you found this video helpful, it'd be cool if you could click the like button and share the video, and then that way it'll make it easier for other people to be able to find this information so they can make their own cards. Also, take a minute to go to my website, which you can see right here, surrealpixelstudio.com. There's a lot of cool stuff there to check out. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.